Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being the host today. Uh, we use and see around us a huge bounty of mined metals, from the mundane roads and construction to the more refined, if you'll pardon the pun, high-tech electronics and devices. But useful metals comprise a tiny percentage of the material that is mined, leaving hundreds of millions of tons of mine waste rock, and mill tailings, often acid generating and or toxic on the surface, to be safely managed for decades, centuries, and millennia to come. Mining then is essentially a waste management industry, and its impacts on water only begin with the diversion, consumption, and contamination of water from mine operations and extend through time and space as potentially perpetual pollution, as well as latent threat of catastrophic contamination and destruction in the event of a containment dam failure. This presentation will address the scope and the implications of this problem in the context of mining being widely and self-interestedly promoted as necessary for the transition to renewable energy to address the climate crisis. One moment, please. Jamie Kneen's title is Canada Program Co-Lead and Outreach Coordinator. He leads Mining Watch's work on mining policy development and individual mining projects in Western and Northern Canada, leading policy reform and providing strategic and technical support to communities affected by mineral exploration and mining projects. With a degree in biology and ecology from McGill University, Jamie has been involved with environmental and resource management issues, including mining, frequently related to Indigenous land rights, for many years. Jamie, I turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude, and thank you for the invitation to speak today, and thank you for the introduction. So I want to open up just with a little picture of what we're talking about. So this is from the Hudson Bay Lowlands in Ontario, and an area that is subject to a lot of attention these days as the so-called Ring of Fire, the area of far northern Ontario that is the site of a lot of mining exploration and some considerable amount of ore that's been discovered. The pressure, and I think probably people are quite aware of the situation and of Premier Ford's promise to jump on the bulldozer himself to get this development underway. But this is a vast roadless area. The First Nations, the Cree and OG Cree of the region, are the people who've lived there for millennia and have been the custodians of those lands and environments. But it's also a massive carbon sink. So what you see here is a bog, what some journalists have continued to refer to as a swamp. They say that this is a swampy area and therefore worthless and suitable for, being bulldozed into a mine. And yet it is also a massive peatland and water resource that the First Nations refer to as the breathing lands because of the kinds of exchange between air, water, and land that take place through this ecosystem. So it's also a massive carbon sink. And I know the Wildlands League and others have done some calculations on this and determined that significant development in the Ring of Fire would basically wipe out all of Canada's Paris commitments for the next 10 years. So that's just to give you a sense, and because I wanted to focus on water cycles and water, that this is the maybe the epitome of the contradictions that we're facing in terms of mining development and fresh water in Canada. Now, mining, and as we sort of alluded to in the introduction there, mining poses threats to fresh water in a number of different ways, in terms of water quantity through dewatering, diversion, and consumption. So if you want to build a mine, you have to, at least in our part of the world, where you're going below the water table, you have to remove a lot of water. And you have to make sure that that water isn't going to come back in, whether it's an underground or open pit mine, doesn't really matter. You want to make sure that that water isn't coming in and filling your facility while you're working in it. And then water is also consumed in the production process, the actual crushing and processing of ores. And in some cases, it's even used to transport material as a slurry. And I think one of the more egregious misuses of fresh water that I can think of. That leads to temporary and in some cases permanent changes in groundwater and surface water flows. So you can actually, by removing enough water from an aquifer, you can change the relationship between aquifers. That may be more or less permanent. And those can also be direct or indirect changes. So again, in the example of the Ring of Fire, you're talking about mining, but you're also talking about roads and access for electric services and so on that will all have a dramatic effect on the water flows, as both surface and subsurface in the region. In terms of water quality, we're talking about various forms of contamination. So primarily involving heavy metals, but also process chemicals, including things like nitrogen from blasting. So that makes its way into the water in the mine. We're talking about process effluent. So again, the water that's used in the milling and processing of mined materials that can spill, but it can also just be routinely pumped out into the landscape with or without adequate treatment. As I mentioned before, water removed from mines is also contaminated because it's had to come through metal-bearing ores and so on. So it can be radioactive. It can be, depending on the nature of the ore bodies, it can have various forms of contamination. And then again, from water, surface water and groundwater flowing over, around, and under the mines and surface facilities, but especially the waste rock piles and tailing storage facilities. So the waste rock is the material that's removed from the mine that does not have enough metal in it to make it worth processing, but can still contain significant amounts of contaminants, and also sulfides, which becomes important. And the tailings are more like fine sand, typically, that after the ore is crushed and it's gone through the processing, what's left is the tailings. And these also contain, whatever metals were not removed in the processing. And again, especially because in this case it's been ground to a fine consistency, very much available to the environment and weathering and air and water processes. This is also a source of acid mine drainage. I mentioned the sulfides, and that, like I say, that's important because when the sulfide rocks are exposed to air and water, then you get oxygenation of the sulfides, and you get sulfuric acid formed as the oxidation product. So that is dangerous on its own. We'll come back to this, I think, because it's a it's a huge problem for the mining industry. But the basic process is fairly straightforward. You're taking rocks out of the ground that are more or less in equilibrium, and are fairly solid, and you're breaking them up and crushing them, in some cases to a pretty fine consistency, and then leaving them on the surface where they're exposed to air and water flows and precisely the kinds of chemical processes that will liberate acid and heavy metals into the environment. That metal contamination doesn't require acid, but the presence of acid speeds up the leaching process. There can equally be heavy metal contamination through neutral processing without the acid process. Now, again, in the Ring of Fire area, this is the Attawapiskat River, which flows into Hudson Bay, and one of the major rivers in the region. And I put this up again just to emphasize the idea that certainly the Hudson Bay lowlands, but large parts of Canada, all through the Canadian Shield, are basically water with rock sticking out of it. When you see, what looks like solid ground, it's actually crisscrossed with fault lines, and there's considerable groundwater flow in different directions through those faults. Some of it is fairly slow, some over centuries, some of it's fairly quick, but the basic principle is that until you get pretty far down into the rock, you're not getting distinct aquifers as you do in sedimentary rocks. You're actually just seeing one large related water system. And upstream of the last photo, and in the Attawapiskat River, well, actually near the community of Attawapiskat, is the Victor Diamond Mine, which is now closed. So this picture's from a few years ago, but they've been removing the surface facilities and recontouring the surface and trying to revegetate it. But you can see here how close the mine is to the stream that then goes into the Attawapiskat River, which is in the background. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is just to highlight a different contamination pathway, because it wasn't until the mine was pretty well finished its operating. So it operated for, I think, 12 years altogether in production. And towards the end of that period, well, people noticed, well, actually, it was the Wildlands League staff that noticed this, that there was mercury contamination in the streams, in this surface water downstream of the Victor Diamond Mine, and there's not mercury in the mine. So the question was where it's coming from, and it seems that this is part of the related to the dewatering process, and as the water is removed from the mine to allow mining to proceed underground and below the water table, the surface around it is drying out, and that is allowing methyl mercury to be formed and then washed, through the rain and subsequent water flow into the flow that's being removed from the mine and dumped into the environment. And there was actually some controversy about this because the mining company hadn't been reporting this, and of course the province of Ontario isn't exactly diligently monitoring these things. So it's up to an environmental group that is doing its own monitoring to even discover this and to follow up on it and push for some kind of treatment or mitigation to try and slow that process. Coming back to the acid mine drainage, this is where this little phrase comes from, the perpetual pollution machine. Now, as I mentioned, acid rock drainage is the process where sulfide rocks are exposed to air and water and oxidized to form sulfuric acid. It becomes acid mine drainage when you basically accelerate this process by presenting crushed rock to the environment. And there are some other complications. So the at lower pH, so once that process is underway, it can be accelerated by bacteria, by sulfur bacteria, the Thiobacillus ferroxidans, that produces acid as part of its life cycle, and just accelerates the acid generating process. This has actually been proposed and occasionally used at small scale to help extract metals from rock, but in the wild, as it were, in mine waste, generally, it's much more of just a real problem because you're just accelerating something that's already difficult to control and problematic. And it's problematic because acidification is detrimental to aquatic life. And because, as I was saying before, the low pH accelerates metal leaching from the rock itself. So you have, depending on what is there, you may have arsenic, cobalt, copper, cadmium, lead, nickel, selenium, zinc, mercury, radionuclides of various forms, all now liberated and making their way into the environment at large. Why we call this perpetual is that it's basically unlimited. It will stop when it runs out of sulfide and when it runs out of metal to leach. So some Roman mines are still producing acid drainage, and in some cases, and in modeling around things like waste rock piles, the industry kind of looks at, well, how far can this go before it just runs out of fuel for the process? This can be prevented with careful management. So adequate knowledge of what the rocks are that are being mined and how they're treated when they're mined out, that becomes really important. Separating materials out, so separating the potentially acid generating material, as it's called, from non-potentially acid generating material, and then being able to focus on the potentially acid generating material to try to prevent that from, as I say, going acid. So one of the simplest solutions to that is to keep it underwater so that the oxygen can't get in. You can prevent that process from starting, or by controlling the infiltration of water into a dry stack of material. And I just note that liners are often touted um, by industry as sort of a solution to this kind of thing. Well, we won't have leaching and we won't have oxidation and so on because we have liners in place. And I'll just say that the liners all have a finite life cycle, and the trick and I think engineers that know what they're doing are aware of this, that the important thing is the structure, and the liners are sort of an added layer of protection for a few decades at most. And so what you're looking at is how to design and engineer these structures so that they're more sort of self-contained um, and self-healing, if you will, so that once any liner is breached, that doesn't then become just a wide open source of pollution. Once it started, of course, this is a process that's very expensive and difficult to treat. So I don't have a picture of it, but for many years, the Britannia copper mine in British Columbia was the largest point source of acid pollution in North America, and basically was killing the wildlife in Howe Sound, so out into the ocean, for quite a radius from its facilities until eventually, and it's possible to do this, but with considerable investment and work, um, the mine workings were sealed up and the acid drainage was eventually stopped. So it is that it's a good news story because it's cleaned up now and it's now become kind of a tourist attraction. Um, but I know when I was there 20 years ago, you could, the stream that came out of there ran a beautiful clear blue color because there's absolutely nothing alive there. So this is a process we can see at work in the Tulsiquet Chief Mine in northern British Columbia near the Alaska border, which is actually an international grievance for the Alaskans because they're downstream of it. And um, again, the Taku River is a major salmon river, and both the Taku River Tlingit, on whose territory the Tulsiquet Chief Mine sits, and the Haida and Tlingit people downstream are pushing very hard for the province of British Columbia to clean this thing up. Now, it was, only in operation for a few years out of the 67 years or so since it was opened. But you see here the telltale orange iron oxide formed from, again, the acidification of the probably pyrite rocks in the mine. And we can see here that there's a pipe, and people are trying to they're trying to research and develop plans to mitigate this at this point. And I will give some credit to the province of BC for trying to move ahead. It's a very complicated issue, both legally because of past owners, and technically because you don't really want to make things worse by accident, and you want to make sure that any steps that are being taken to stabilize this and neutralize the acid are not going to create other problems or worse problems down the road. Here you can see just how close we are to the Taku River and the acid that is threatening and occasionally making its way directly into the river. Zooming out a little bit, this is the maps that we did that Mining Watch did as part of the BC Mining Law Reform Network. This was, I think, 3 years ago we did these, and it was just trying to develop a map of contaminated sites of various types across the province, and again, basically trying to pressure the industry and the province to look after these sites. And some of these are abandoned, many of them are operational, many of them are operational but not actually operating. So they're, so-called care and maintenance, which is something that we think the industry does not only when market conditions are not great and they're not making enough money to make it worthwhile, but also as a way of potentially postponing any final reckoning about the liabilities associated with any final closure or cleanup. Because when when a mine is actually closed, there's a whole process that they have to go through to reclaim the bonds that are placed with the province to ensure the cleanup, and then to ensure that the site is actually stabilized and cleaned up to a high enough standard that the companies can recover their bonds and ultimately walk away from the site, leaving it in the control of provincial authorities. So, the technical aspect can be daunting, and we suspect that the industry often just leaves the site on care and maintenance because it costs a few $1 million a year to keep it operational, but just sort of on standby, as opposed to engaging in the whole cleanup and finding out that maybe there's a lot more work there than they were prepared to do. So zooming out again, looking across the country, and I just pulled this mine out of a data set. I don't know why the ones in Saskatchewan all have information points on them, but you kind of get the idea of the presence of mines all across the country, and the particular concentrations in certain places. But the fact that this is not an isolated issue. This is not an issue just in one watershed or another. It's clearly across the country, and the map kind of cuts off the north end of Baffin Island, so the Arctic Bay and Nanisivik mines are not there, or not visible on the map, but they're certainly there on the landscape. These are all historic mines, so this is not looking at new mining. This is just showing where there are abandoned sites and where there may be in a large portion, and it varies, but it's a large portion of cases, there may be acid mine drainage, and there may be serious contamination issues. Which brings me to the topic of tailings dams, because as I mentioned before, the tailings are probably the most dangerous, most volatile part of the the mine's product. And in the mining process, we're generating literally hundreds of millions of tons of material that is contained by earthen dams on the surface of the land, often in the mountains and high up at the maybe even in the headwaters of major watersheds. And this is, potentially quite toxic material, and it is subject to both catastrophic failure if the dam collapses, God forbid, if there's a spill or breach or failure, but also through chronic failure. So leaching and erosion over time will allow those contaminants to go into the watershed. Part of the problem here is that not only do we have hundreds of these facilities across the country, and some of them in relatively precarious condition or situations, but they're also increasing in size, both in height and capacity, as mining production increases and as ore grades decrease, so that there's more waste, more tailings being produced for the amount of metal being extracted. And of course, these structures are subject to gravity. They're subject to erosion, and ultimately the second law of thermodynamics, that we're putting large amounts of material in a fundamentally, like a geologically unstable state, and over time, and that may be over years or decades, and it may be over longer, almost geological time, but it will tend to collapse. And of course, the new projects are also in increasingly remote areas. And one of the things, especially in places like northwestern British Columbia, we see with the retreat of the glaciers that mining companies are going with great enthusiasm into the places where the glaciers used to be. And this, as an opportunity, but it's also, I think, increasing risk, because those are, given that those sites were until recently glaciated, they're also quite a bit less stable geologically. So in terms of going back to the production, we look at production is increasing basically exponentially as not so much with human population, but with human industrialization. Iron is obviously used in pretty much everything in terms of construction as well as manufacturing. But this shows just how quickly that chart is accelerating. And ore grades, so at 1% ore grade, you're talking about 99 tons of waste tailings being produced for every ton of copper extracted. And in many cases, that would be a very rich operation in this day and age. And we're talking about tenths of a percent rather than full percentage points of ore grade metal content. And what happens when tailings dams collapse is this. This is the Mount Poly mine. The tailings dam collapsed in 2014, and 25 million cubic meters of sludge went downstream, basically reamed out Hazeltine Creek and went into Quesnel Lake, where it still is. So, and this is in the Fraser River system in central British Columbia, so that the more liquid part of that contamination made its way into the Fraser River. This is a copper gold mine. It had significant amounts of copper, nickel, and a few other elements in the waste. And copper in particular is quite nasty for aquatic life. It impedes fish development and navigation. So salmon faced with a high copper concentration may just not go that way. We can, if people are interested, we can talk more about what happened there and why. But the one thing that I'll note is that the Mount Poly Mining Corporation was not charged or fined for any of this, even though it seemed to us fairly obvious that there'd been some destruction of fish habitat, for instance, and therefore that grounds for charges under the Federal Fisheries Act, if nothing else, but also probably under provincial environmental protection laws as well. That did not happen. In fact, charges that Mining Watch and also Bev Sellers, who is the chief at the time of the Quetzal First Nation, filed independently, were taken over by the Crown prosecutor and stayed so that they could not be heard. And there's never been any further action taken against the company. And in fact, it is now Mount Poly Mining Company and Imperial Metals are now allowed to pipe effluent directly into Quesnel Lake, which was part of the reason for the breach in the first place, was that they were storing too much water behind this dam. And that was because they were not allowed to pipe effluent directly into Quesnel Lake. It had to be stored and treated. Their water treatment couldn't keep up, and so they were storing too much water, and it was one of the factors that led to the collapse of the dam. It was not a happy story altogether, and the effluent is, as I say, continues to be pumped directly into Quesnel Lake. The material that was the mucky portion of the spilled material is at the bottom of Quesnel Lake, and there were hopes that it would stabilize there, but in fact what's happening is that seasonally and with the action of some of the bottom-dwelling organisms, that those contaminants are being recirculated into the water column in the lake. Now, one of the other factors in this was that the mine construction was dangerous. And as just a little bit of a side trip here into the technology of building large dams, there are basically three construction types. So the upstream type is built, and as the dam is developed and as more material is accumulated, the raises, so the new layers of the dam, are built on top of the tailings material, and this is potentially quite unstable and is illegal in Chile and Brazil, but quite legal in Canada. The most stable version of the structure is downstream, and you can see it's fairly obvious that it uses a huge amount more material, takes a lot more work to build, and is considerably more stable than other construction forms. And the center line is kind of a modification or a truce between those two. So it's a bit of both. It's built on top of the center line of the dam, but without the added security of building back and building more of a buttress against collapse. And it's easy for a centerline dam to become a modified centerline dam and sort of creep to the left and become more of an upstream dam. And that is in fact what was being used at Mount Poly, so that it was an inherently unstable structure that was made more unstable by, let's say, economization by the mining company, who made, as the mine was built, it was built steeper and steeper, and so the margin of safety was being reduced in terms of the slope, and then in terms of the actual construction into the tailings area itself. So for those that like these kinds of things, this is fun, or at least very interesting. And for the rest of you, I'm sorry for the little side trip there, but I think it's fascinating to see, and especially the fact that, from a legal standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, this is something that doesn't have to be allowed to happen. And I think what a lot of communities and organizations like my own are advocating is that we need the strongest possible safety standards, and that if this is not going to be done in the safest possible way economically, then that is basically telling you that you don't have a project. Here's another map that we did of British Columbia more recently, just showing the tailings, so focusing on tailings dams and the their status and level of risk and so on. So, again, because over time, these are basically large sources of potential contamination that will be eventually spread downstream and across the landscape. And, we kind of hope that happens after they've been neutralized and are not posing a real threat um, to communities or ecosystems. But in the short term, certainly in the case of a dam failure, there are potentially very serious effects and impacts to downstream communities and habitats. So, and I haven't covered it here, but the worst one so far is the Brumadinho spill in Brazil. The tailings dam collapsed, and I think the total was 270 people killed immediately downstream, and just a huge swath of land coated in toxic mud. So that's kind of, I won't even say the worst case scenario, because there are bigger mines and bigger tailings dams out there that could fail, but it is, that's how bad it can be. And we have an example here. Now, if you'll humor me for a minute and 10 seconds, we can look at what happens in southern BC, so the Copper Mountain mine in southern British Columbia. And this is a group on the American side, because they're quite concerned about the downstream effects of this. And you can see where the mine is located, and then the downstream goes into U.S. territory. What happens if there's a 40% failure? So if 40% of the material in that tailings dam goes downstream, it pretty much wipes out the town of Princeton. It pretty much wipes out the town of Headley, and it wipes out a large part of the entire river valley as it goes downstream. They actually did a flyover, sort of an animation simulation of this, which is even more dramatic, but it's longer, so I didn't want to put you through that. So this material is going down the Similkameen, and it doesn't actually stop at the border. It's just the simulation that stops at the border, but that's the presentation of what a catastrophic spill of that kind could look like. And just to give a sense of what that means in a national context, so the previous mine, the previous map was about existing, past historic mines, and this one is about new mines and active projects. So a lot of we don't need to look at southern Saskatchewan, which is all potash mines. You can see the coal mines in gray through Alberta and BC, but we're seeing a lot of copper, gold, platinum group metals, specialty metals, which I think is code for uranium in many cases. Certainly in the Saskatchewan ones it is, and iron ore in green. So this is just basically to emphasize again that not only do we have abandoned mines and historic mining sites across the country, but we've got new ones popping up, and now these are all active projects that or nearly active. So that will be creating more and more of a contaminant risk on the landscape for coming decades. Now, what needs to happen is that we need to de-risk the existing tailings and waste rock dumps, and we need to enforce existing laws and regulations to protect water. We need to impose stricter conditions on all aspects of new mining projects, so including water management and waste rock and tailings. We need to be looking at reprocessing tailings and waste rock to extract the valuable materials, but also to make those dumps safer. So to try and stabilize them, to make them less vulnerable to collapse or to erosion, and also to not just extract the profitable materials. And I use the word valuable very carefully because I want to make sure that we're extracting the metals, all the metals that we can from these wastes, not just the ones that are profitable. And that's going to be a really key policy issue where this is happening, because I think the temptation and certainly the commercial interest will be to go in, realize that, oh, there's some metal in there that they weren't interested in the 70s, but now it's important and it's valuable, so we're going to go in and reprocess and extract whatever that metal is and nothing else. And it will be set up for maximum profit, not for maximum safety. And that's basically the statement we're trying to make, is that safety has to come first. If it's not safe, it shouldn't be done. And likewise, when mining is taking place, that all the metals are removed from the ores, not just the ones that are most profitable. Now we see, in a lot of cases, there's, copper and gold are found commingled, so they're extracting copper and gold. But again, all of the other minor metals are left in the tailings and waste rock and treated as waste, and can become pollution. And finally, and maybe I leave the best for last, the most important thing is to reduce demand, to reduce the extractive pressure on landscapes, on watersheds, on ecosystems, and on communities, so that we're not just meeting the needs of investors, the wishes to make profit from all of this by expanding production exponentially, by building everything everywhere, by failing to rein in overconsumption. We create excess demand that is profitable, but is also deadly. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I have a prerogative of asking the first question. This is really an amazing array of history, and appreciate so much your summary. What's the brief history of Mining Watch? Did it start as a small organization and grow up, or was it funded to serve its purpose? What can you tell us briefly about that?
Mining Watch started 25 years ago. It was a small organization. It's still a small organization. We've gone from 3 people doing 2 jobs to 6 staff. So it's not, we're not a big, powerful organization. And as a result, we work primarily through collaboration and coalitions and networks, because we do a lot of work on our own research and so on, but we also rely on others to a very large extent. And we need to know who's trustworthy, who has the right information, and who can we work with to make things happen. And, Mining Watch was created, in the late 1990s. We were seeing the expansion of the mining industry globally as well as across Canada, and also increasingly into Indigenous territories. And, so that was when the Nunavut land claim was coming into effect. The Labrador Inuit Nunatsiavut land claim was being negotiated. And so we were part of that context. And in many ways, those issues have not changed. The fundamental conflict in the mining sector is between communities and mining interests, and the affected communities have a lot less power in that relationship. Even governments in many cases have less power because we're talking about corporations in some cases that are larger than the economies of some countries. So they wield a lot of influence. And so, trying to bring them under control, um, both through legal and regulatory processes, but also through pretty much any other form of pressure that you can imagine, is a challenge. And it's one that we're still facing. And in the current context, with the discussion of critical minerals and the claimed need to accelerate and expand mining to meet the energy transition and our net zero commitments and so on, is really just exaggerating that whole dynamic.
Thank you. This it makes the information set that you've described all the more amazing that it came out of a small group of people. Ted, you have the first question. You actually have two questions in there. I'll leave it up
Yeah,
to you.
they kind of run together. It has to do with accountability for the mess you make. I spent many years with the Lands Director of Environment Canada trying to get people to restore land to the point where it was back at least usable. And
Mhm.
I'll start with the other one first. Saskatchewan was pretty good. They were one of the first ones to put in really good reclamation standards, even up to the land pretty well having to be in the same shape, the same quality, and the same drainage after they went away. That started as early as about the mid 70s. And they actually, apart from relic sites, by and large, they wouldn't let a company dig next to the next one until they restored the one they just finished with to the one point, and they had enough money in the bank. On the other hand, my opinion from what I saw back then, and maybe the same, was a lot of people walked away. And there were other companies, not that one was in coal in Saskatchewan and also a bit for potash. But can a company just walk away? And are they still doing that? Are there relic mines that are left? And we discover that it was owned by somebody in Indonesia or or Nigeria, and the likelihood of getting any money back from them is near zero. Anyway, that was just my question. Are we actually able to collect money? And are our current governments, do they have enough guts to actually demand to have money because it might slow down the rate?
Yeah. Um, this is a provincial matter,
Yeah.
and so it varies from province to province.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I agree. Saskatchewan had some pretty good
Yeah.
standards in place. I'm not sure what their status is anymore.
They're not doing as much coal anymore, so it may have gone away.
Right. Yeah. But BC has made considerable advances. I think we still disagree with them in terms of what the targets should be and so on, and the methodologies are probably debatable. We've sort of stuck with the notion that whatever the model says, the actual cost will probably be about twice as much because it always is.
Yeah.
Just it's not a scientific thing. It's just like, well, every time this happens, the price tag doubles. In some cases, it's worse. There some of the Faro mine in the
Yeah.
Yukon is now like several $billion over budget. $1 billion.
Yeah.
Um,
Have you talked to David Doherty? Because when I was in Environment Canada, he was there at the same time, and he was doing essentially documentation of the costs of rehabilitation, ranging from military sites to mines to
right.
whatever, including things like leaking storage tanks and the whole bit. If
Yeah.
he's not here today, I'd immediately tell us about it, because he had some very good data
Mhm.
actually published.
Yeah, no, that would be great.
Yeah.
So, but British Columbia, they've done an audit. They've started taking steps to reduce that
Yeah.
gap,
Good.
making sure that those bonds are in place
Mhm.
and that every operation is bonded and so on. Ontario's been going the opposite direction. So
Seen that.
Ontario allows large corporations to self-assure, which basically means they don't have to do
Mhm.
anything.
Yeah.
They sort of assume that You know, an operation like Vale, a company like Vale is big enough to pay for whatever it has to pay for, ignoring the reality that it can leave at any time
Yeah.
just because it's worth, just because it's big. And yeah, and then a lot of other areas of what they've been moving back to, you know, more graduated sort of piecemeal assurances, so that that money may or may not be there when we need it, and that's a real weakness.
Fair enough. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, it's good.
I mean, the other, yeah, I mean, the corollary, of course, is, oh, and the other thing Ontario has been doing is weakening the restoration standards.
Yeah.
So rather than trying to get back to anything close to the natural condition, they're basically downgrading it to like, well, what if we just bring it back to like industrial use,
Mhm.
from waste, from sheer waste to just industrial use. And
Well, the other argument was it costs too much to bring it back to the good agricultural land it used to be. And
yeah,
we won that one with Saskatchewan, but we didn't win that one very well with Ontario.
no, and like I say, Ontario's been going backwards.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And Richard, you're on deck. And Raymond, you have the floor.
Hi, Jamie. Very interesting presentation, and I share your concern that there's mining companies are getting away with literally murder. But my question is that the map, you did mention a bit of coal on there, but I didn't see where that was on the map. The legend didn't seem to have it, but you don't have anything else about fossil fuels, and fossil fuels, they mine 15 billion tons per year of stuff, and if you look at the fracking in particular in northern BC, and the oil wells that are abandoned all over Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's a huge amount of toxic stuff coming out of those things. So is that on purpose you exclude them because it's not part of your efforts, or because I'm concerned that if we're looking
that's
just
exactly it. It's not out of a lack of concern. It's out of the need to focus our efforts in some respects. And so we work essentially on hard rock mining, so metal mining rather than, and diamonds rather than you know, coal and tar sands and that kind of thing.
Okay, so I guess the concern I have is I would not in any way, shape, or form, let the fossil fuel industry get off with the all the damage they're doing, right? And perspective on that is, I
No,
think, important, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's in a way, yeah, I mean, there's a whole discussion there, and it overlaps considerably when we're talking about coal mining, for instance, especially in BC and the Elk Valley and the selenium contamination there as a, you know, as a mining issue. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, these are huge issues.
Actually, Claude, if you don't mind, just a small other question. So
Go
there's
ahead.
tailings ponds all over the place for rock mining, right? There's also some in the oil sands area.
Oh yeah.
Isn't it possible to squeeze the water out somehow and just leave the more heavier stuff that would be less prone to leak?
Yes. Well, for metal mines, it's quite possible, and in a way, the safest technology then is a drier, what's called a dry stack tailings pile. So you remove more of the water, you end up with something that's not even squishy, it's quite solid, and it will be stable over a much longer period of time. The issue then is just keeping water from getting into it and forming acid and leaching. Um, as I say, it's more expensive. So one of the things that never fails to surprise me in this whole question, this whole industry, is how unwilling the industry is to spend a little bit of extra money for even a fairly easy gain in anything. They just don't want to spend money on anything, and in some cases, like, these operations are actually quite marginal, and they'll be profitable, but only if they can keep them streamlined, as it were. So that's, yeah. The other thing is, I don't know that much about the tar sands mining and processing, but my understanding is that it's actually much harder to take water out of those tailings, because of the mix of hydrocarbons.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Richard, can you turn on your mic? It looks like you have some video problems.
Oh, sorry. One more thing on that. The other reason that it can be hard to remove water is if you've got too many fine particles. So if you've got kind of a clay, it's really hard to dry out. Whereas if you've got a sandier kind of composition, you can just squeeze it.
Okay, you can't see me?
No, we can't, but go right ahead and
Go ahead.
ask your question. And then Nigel is on deck.
Okay, that's fine. Listen, great talk. Obviously, there's two issues here. One is going backwards and on the legacy mines and the legacy of destruction and who knows, everything that you've talked about today that goes backwards. But then going forwards, is there a requirement for new mine development to assess the impact on human health and ecosystems, number one, and is that enforced?
How much time do you have? This is one of my favorite topics.
Take the time
The short
you need.
answer is not generally, not always. So Ontario, for instance, does not require environmental assessment of new mining projects or any private project for that matter. And the provincial assessment processes are inconsistent and mostly pretty poor. Quebec is a bit better. People kind of like the Quebec process. It's still subject to political interference, and it's basically the same proponent-driven model of assessment that we have across the country. And then in Quebec, the government will just override recommendations. So people feel good about the assessment process, and the conclusions and recommendations are solid, and then the government just bypasses them. Federally, only the largest mines are subject to assessment at this point, and you can have a fairly major mining project, and you can have major expansions of mining projects that are not subject to assessment. So on the one hand, the theory is there, and I think there's a fair bit of a pretty decent practice and science behind this. We do know what to look for. And it's just a question of having a process in place that allows those questions to be asked and demands the proper answers. And that is where, unfortunately, where things tend to fall apart.
Have you tried engaging any of the senators on the Hill that are environmentally oriented and so forth? I mean, I can give you some names on that. No?
Senator Galvez has been really good.
Exactly. It's one of the people from her office is giving a talk in 2 weeks.
Yeah. The problems are more political than that. And so we've got provincial governments that don't want the federal government to do any assessment in resource industries. They've got a Supreme Court ruling now backing them up on that. And, so we will continue to have federal reviews, but they will be more restricted than before. And, I having been working on this for a long time, I think things are far worse now than they were 20 or even 30 years ago.
Well, 3 weeks from today, we're getting somebody from Senator Galvez's office, someone who works with her, who now works for Eco Justice, who's going to give us a talk on the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which actually some of that will feed directly into, first investments in mines and so forth. So you might want to join in on that one. May 1st.
Sure. Yep.
Okay, thank you. John Legg is on deck, and Nigel, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jamie. A very informative presentation. I'd like to return to the Hudson's Bay lowlands and, the question around the so-called Ring of Fire. You mentioned in terms of the risk of, development to this area, and you use the adjective significant. Is that being defined, or can you define that? I mean, I follow it insofar as what I read in the Globe and Mail, and it seems unlikely that there will be no mine there. I don't know if I'm correct in that assessment. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm pretty sure there will be no mines there for quite a while,
Okay.
like 10 or 15 years.
All right. Okay.
I mean, the current projects that are being pushed through are the access roads. So to Martin Falls and Wibbequay. And, I always say I have a certain amount of sympathy for those communities because they're living with real accessibility problems and, cost of living and food and building supplies and so on. That's, at least 5 times what it needs to be.
Mhm.
And it's not like they're getting a lot of,
Mhm.
corresponding levels of support from the government. So, it's not a crazy situation for them to want a road, but the impacts of those roads will be significant. And in all of those cases, again, it is ridiculous that they're having 6 separate environmental assessments for 3 segments of road, because there's a provincial and federal assessment for each one, and nobody is willing to step forward and say this is all one connected project, and go to court if necessary to have some sanity brought into that process. But in each case, the First Nations are acting as the proponents on behalf of the mining companies. And in each case, they've established terms of reference and then turned around and said, okay, it's going to take us at least 3 years to get the data to go ahead with the assessment. So that's just the first step of the process. And then, and then there's the question of how much of that resource is actually worth anything. And that depends on which metals are marketable and what the market conditions are. Meanwhile, we've got new projects coming up like the Crawford Nickel project, which is, within a reasonable distance of existing electric and rail lines. And
that's lowlands, is it? That's in that area, is it?
No, that's in the Timmins area.
Ah.
So in an area that's already developed, you have the prospect of getting something operational within a few years.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Sort of open up the complexities of that and give me an idea. Thank you.
Okay, Charles, you're on deck, and now John Legg has the floor.
Thanks, Claude. Jamie, you must, I hope you react well to coffee, because it seems to me you have an unlimited amount of work ahead of you. And I don't know how there we are. I'm having a hard time getting a good handle on this, so I decided to classify it as risk. So here's my question. It's an unfair question. I realize that. Here it is. If you had to classify mines, and here I'd like you to include fossil fuels, as I think Raymond Larry did, in terms of risk of damage, how would the list go? For example, would fossil fuels be at the top of the list because of climate change, etc.? And then what would be the next few types of mines in terms of high risk of damage? And let's give it to make it more difficult at first and then easier Canada-wide, and then maybe, as you've already done very usefully near the end, some questions province-wide.
So that is an awkward question because it is quite multidimensional, and each of those aspects, I think, is quite context dependent.
Right, right.
So, I mean, they're complex in the sense that you could say, okay, fossil fuel extraction may be more or less problematic. So, I mean, um, drilling oil is one thing. Open pit mining for tar sands is a whole different process and much, much different in terms of its impacts, even if it's still producing oil that is, burned as fuel. The same with, even with coal mining. The coal mines in southern Saskatchewan that I visited were, I would say, fairly benign in their environmental impact. They actually could be rehabilitated. There were not massive long-term impacts on the water compared with other areas where you've got, in the Alberta and BC, where you've got this, deadly contamination coming out of those mines. It's just unmanageable. And then when you get into other products, so I would say, nickel is probably more dangerous than copper because the processing is more intensive, and you can fairly readily process copper with a lot of electricity, but you don't need a lot of other polluting industry associated with it. Whereas nickel can be smelted with coal, as is happening now in Indonesia, and it's just filthy. So the environmental impacts are multiplied in every direction. So and it's really hard to control that. So I think each of these things, once you break it down, it gets more complex, and you could do some modeling, I suppose, to try and figure out how much of different types of mining were taking place in different conditions that would make it more or less dangerous. And again, it also depends on the landscape. So we look at copper and gold mining in British Columbia, because of the landscape and because of the altitude and watersheds that are affected. I would say it's more risky than copper mining in some other parts of the world. So yeah, it's a long way to say I don't really have an answer to that question, just more complexity and coming back to, as Friends of the Earth used to say, Friends of the Earth International used to have a campaign to say that just said less mining for a better world.
Right.
Not, and they weren't saying none, they were just saying less.
Well, thank you for that. That was a very good stab at a very unfair question. And
the only other thing I want to throw in, because I haven't mentioned it yet, is gold mining. And the question of why are we still allowing gold mining to happen when it's not a product that is needed? The World Gold Council says something like 8% of world gold production goes into electronics and industrial use. And that level of demand could easily be fulfilled by the massive amounts of gold that are already mined and in storage.
Right.
Not to mention that more gold is still being produced out of multi-metallic mines like copper gold mines that produce a fair bit of both. So the answer is that gold is the most valuable product of the Canadian mining industry. Most mines in Canada are gold mines, not the biggest ones. Well, there are a couple of really big ones, but there's a lot of small gold mines. But gold, although obviously less of it is actually produced than pretty much anything else, is the single largest value contributor in Canadian mining. Not copper, not nickel, not iron.
That's because of the privileged position gold used to have in terms of its financial worth.
But it continues creating environmental liabilities.
Right. Whew. Well,
I'll leave you that one.
I wish you success in your future work.
Thanks, John.
Okay. Thank you, John. And Raymond Leary is on deck, and Charles, you now have the floor.
Jamie, thank you. It's good work, though it depresses the hell out of me. When I was in graduate school and we were learning the laws of energy conservation and so forth, one of my colleagues came up with the law of the conservation of evil, so that evil can be transformed, changed in form, but neither created nor destroyed. So if there was urban poverty, you could get rid of the poverty, but it would be at the expense of pollution and other things and so forth. So I'm reminded of that when I think about all the calls for reducing CO2, almost all of which are ultimately going to require a lot more hard rock mining. For example, an electric vehicle has 3 times at least the copper of an internal combustion and so forth. And Simon Michaud in Finland has, tried to evaluate what a lot of these things would be. And so I'm wondering, can that be made part of your education? Because people think there's a free lunch, and there's no free lunch. And you're just shifting the impact from one type of impact, CO2, to another, this hard rock mining, and what we're doing. And nobody will say it, but I'll say it. The only solution is to stop breeding.
Well, the other thing is capitalism.
Yeah, well,
And
communism does just fine. It's industrialization, maybe, whether it's through capitalism. I don't want to let capitalism off the hook, but it's not just capitalism. It's complicated. But it all comes down to how many people we have and how affluent each of them are. The old iPad equation of Paul Ehrlich.
Yeah, we don't, and I've seen various versions of modeling around that, around what a reasonable income and consumption level would be for the number of humans that we have on Earth. And it's not terrible, but it does involve a lot different distribution of goods and wealth, and and the issue, and I point to capitalism as the as it's been said, the electric vehicle industry exists to save the car industry, not to save the planet. Because if you wanted to save the planet, you'd focus on public transit and you'd look at changing patterns of residential and productive areas and so on. And in fact, the technologies are largely ones that we already have. We already have buses. We already have trains. The tracks aren't in very good shape anymore, but getting people onto buses is a fairly quick and easy way to reduce the transport component of GHG emissions. And we don't have to, then you can go about electrifying the buses and building the LRTs and so on. But dramatic changes can be made with what we have at hand, and that's what we need to be pushing for.
I think that's only part of it, but it's a good part, I suppose. Then don't bump into Jevon's paradox, please.
You do?
Yeah, lots of things. But yes, but anyway, keep doing what you're doing. I think it was, although depressing me very much, it was good.
Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Art Hunter is on deck, and Raymond, you have the floor.
Yeah, sorry, just a small comment before I ask the question. I worked a lot on buses, and you're right, they need to be electrified to be really better, because they still spew out lots and lots of particulate matter and all that, because they're powered by diesel, right? So the question I have is, given some of the stuff you said about the regulations in Canada being relaxed, and what we've seen over the years, over the last few decades from the federal side, and we have this oil industry that has this narrative that we have ethical oil here in Canada somehow. And we could debate that for quite a while. But on the mining side, there's this narrative that Canadian mines are somehow better because the regulations are tougher here or something. Yeah, I get the impression from what you're saying that that is not quite the reality. So how do we fare compared to other countries out there? Like Indonesia is probably maybe one of the worst examples, but there's other countries out there that have varying levels of regulation that would impact the leaching and all this kind of stuff that would happen if this bad stuff, right?
So yeah, so on the one hand, I would say overall we do things somewhat better here. I think, and it's not just a question of regulation, it's also just practice. And there's sort of an expectation of performance that Canadians have that isn't necessarily present elsewhere. But in terms of laws and regulations, and especially enforcement, we don't do that well. And the issue is not that different in other parts of the world. So, Ecuador, Colombia, particularly Latin American countries might have very good laws. Actually, a number of African countries as well have very good laws and no enforcement whatsoever. So the fact that we've got just really poor enforcement makes us better, but the regulations might not actually be better here than they are elsewhere. But that I think there's two problems with that narrative, and one is the one that you pointed to, that we're not necessarily that good here. But the other is that we should really be focusing on higher standards globally, and not responding to difficulties in the Congo by saying, well, we'll do that here and it'll be better somehow. We'll have better copper mines here than we will in the Congo. But actually looking at how mining in the Congo can be better done so that it is more, environmentally and economically responsible. And what is the institutional base for that, and what role can Canada play, or UN agencies and so on, as they used to, in helping reinforce those administrations, and combating corruption and supporting enforcement and so on. And we do see from time to time, countries like Zambia or Guatemala, where the courts have actually taken very strong stands on environmental or human rights protection around mining, kind of unexpectedly, because we don't expect them to to be very competent, but they can be. And in a way, I think part of what we need to do is shift that expectation and say, no, actually, if we rather than punishing people for their situation, if we share our expectations with them and help them meet those expectations, then we can all do better.
So I guess, and then the narrative from the mining industry that we're better here is not really the case, right? So I'm thinking we shouldn't let them get away with saying that, because it's debatable whether we're doing that better, right?
Well, and then when you've got the provinces jumping out and saying, we want to attract environmentally and socially and responsible investment because of our great standards, and you kind of say, what are you talking about? Let's see some enforcement first, and then you can say that. Let's see a mine that is, instead of being allowed to pollute for years and pay some fines, let's see them actually shut down, as would happen in other jurisdictions.
Thank you, Raymond. Mike Nickerson, you're on deck, and Art, you have the floor.
Mine is a follow-on to what just transpired here. I'm particularly interested in the role of United Nations in trying to take on some and set up a forum for international responsibilities. I look at countries that like China, Australia, Russia, and they're big mining communities in those countries, as in Canada and other parts of the world. I would like you to say a little bit more about the UN. You did allude to it, and how they have lost control, or they're not as participating as vigorously, or whatever has happened. Could you give us a little bit of history and what you see, if anything, on the horizon for UN's role in this?
Well, I guess there are a couple of different pieces of that, and one is just that, I think principally through the 70s and 80s, UN agencies were active in working with developing countries and sort of the post-colonial period of trying to develop environmental regulation and enforcement, in particular, but also other areas like health got a lot of attention. And that seems to have just gone by the wayside in the meantime. And the other is that, and just to say, there's a lot of potential there. We have the bodies exist. They're just not given the resources or the space to work anymore. And the other is that there was actually an effort to develop a global standard on mine tailings, and the UN Environment Program was part of that, and it ended up being essentially taken over by the mining industry, by the International Council on Metals and Mining, because they had the resources and they had the staff, and they could throw money and energy at this thing, and develop drafts and push the whole process forward in the direction that they wanted it to, and the influence to make sure that other people didn't have an in on it, and so that got kind of hijacked. But at the same time, it also pointed to the potential for something stronger, and we were actually looking at things like the International Civil Aviation Authority as a model for this kind of global regulation, where countries all agree that planes really shouldn't fall out of the sky. And the only way to do that is to have a strong enough level of international cooperation and actual legal authority to enforce those regulations, with the result that planes mostly don't fall out of the sky. Mostly. And why can't we do that with environmental issues, especially ones that have a large technical component like mine tailings, where there's lots of engineering, there's lots of expertise around the world related to water dams and tailings dams that can be brought to bear on this, and could have legal authority. So that's kind of the potential of the system, I think, if we allow it to work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think the final comment will come from Mike Nickerson before Ted takes over for our official thanks.
Well,
Go ahead,
hi,
Mike.
thank you very much. Hi, Jamie. It's good to see you're still active. I recall meeting many years ago in the Environment Network. My question has to do, as a wrap-up question to your wrap-up comment, the best for last, we need to reduce consumption. And I'm wondering if you've heard about the More Fun, Less Stuff project. The idea is to provide, encouragement for people to get satisfaction from living in a way that they are not less inclined to consume. Like if you just say, well, consume less, that's not nearly as appealing as enjoy life more. We're trying to encourage, because we're going to have a complete shift of cultural style if we're going to make it through the next 100 years. And we might as well get used to the fact that we're just going to have to knuckle under and enjoy ourselves.
I'm not familiar with that project, but I agree absolutely with your premise. That's one of the issues around, the whole discussion around degrowth is simply the word degrowth, because people react to that and they say, well, but then what? Well, how many blankets do you need?
I'll send you some notes.
Sure.
Thank you very much. So Ted, it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jamie. That was wonderful as usual. You and I have been doing the same stuff, but in different sectors for a long time, trying to get the rules so that people don't wreck spaces while they're trying to use it for whatever they want to extract. In my case, it was land and coasts, and you were dealing with the minerals and metals. But it sounds like the challenges have generally been largely the same. The same people are trying to shaft us, get rid of the rules that try and get greed to not overtake everything. I'll ask you one question before I give you a full thank you. Have the initiatives to ban blood diamonds or to ban child labor in the mines had any resonance? Are they a model for countries stopping other places from sending us stuff that is immorally extracted?
Yes and no. I mean, I think both of those are flawed models, but
Yeah.
they do show us the potential. They show us on the one hand what happens when people get wound up about something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the cultural or popular focus on an issue, as you did with the Blood Diamonds movie and so on, that can really actually create quite a bit of pressure. And it's not a direct economic push, it's not a direct political push, but it creates a cultural push that can have quite an impact. And it's the same with child labor. I think there's a social consensus around the issue that then the hard part is making sure that is not being undermined or watered down by the commercial interests behind it, so that and it does actually come full circle, because the issue eventually comes back to demand. And if people want cheap clothes and cheap goods, then we run the risk of child labor, because it starts being, you get into production situations where there's an incentive to throw everybody into the product, even if they're 12 years old, they've got a role to play. So and like the current Canadian legislation against forced labor it's useless. It says, please let us know if you think you might be looking at something. You don't have to document anything. You don't have to do anything. Obviously, there's a huge issue there. The other, the problem with the Kimberley process that was developed to deal with the diamond industry is that it was an agreement between governments. And so when the government of Zimbabwe was sending the military into its own diamond fields and massacring people and taking over their, small-scale diamond mines, it could exempt itself from criticism because the government was the representative in this body. And it's a bit like the UN Security Council. As long as Russia will never sanction itself within the UN, because that's not how that works.
Yeah, it's kind of like an oxymoron of ethics
on the one hand, shows the potential of taking action there, and
ethics.
So it's a question of coming up with a regulatory structure that will actually embody what people think it should.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jamie. That we've pretty well come full circle from trying to create things around to looking at real problems and some of the things that can be done about them. So again, thank you very much. You talked to us on this a couple of years ago as well, and it was excellent then, and it's excellent again. So thank you very much. Now here comes the commercial. We want any of you who do not now belong to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome to mail us your money for your annual dues. There are a few of you who have forgotten to do that, and it's now time to send it. Secondly, we want to remind you to please share these presentations with others. Art has just given us some excellent data on how widely shared it does get. And I think he showed it earlier, but it's also on our websites. And please, when you go to the YouTube, just hit subscribe, because that helps us with them, gets us a better deal, I think, and it never hurts to share good ideas. So again, thank you ever so much, and we'll see you again shortly.